Good evening. I'm Jackie Kemp, and I'm tonight we can chat to William Duguid, who's the works at the ACT at the Hub, the Yes Hub in Perth. He's an SNP activist, and obviously we're going to discuss the big news of the day, which is Nicola Sturgeon's Yes activist. Yeah.
An
Um,
activist, but not an SNP one, I think. That's all.
Yes, yes, sorry. Sorry, yes, yes movement, generally yes movement rather than and sorry about that. And but first of all, before we get to that, I'm just going to give you a brief update about what's been happening in in Ukraine. So it's day 357 of the conflict. Ukrainian forces claim to have repelled some Russian attacks in the eastern region of Luhansk, but the situation there remains difficult, Zelensky's office said. Russia said earlier that its troops had broken through two fortified lines of Ukrainian defences on the eastern front. The governor of Luhansk, Serhiy Haidai, said claims that Ukrainian troops had pulled back does not correspond to reality. Neither sets of claims have been independently verified. At least 6,000 children from Ukraine have attended Russian re-education camps in the past year, with several hundred held for weeks or months beyond their scheduled return date, according to a new report published in the US. Ukraine's Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov said Zelensky has asked him to remain in his current post after a corruption scandal beset his ministry and put his rule in doubt. Russia's army is estimated to have lost nearly 40% of its pre-war fleet of tanks after 9 months of fighting, according to a count by a specialist think tank, the International Institute of Strategic Studies. The European Commission has called for a ban on the export of vital technology to Russia worth 11 billion to further weaken the Kremlin's war effort. NATO defence ministers are meeting today in Brussels, where the alliance's head, Jens Stoltenberg, urged Western countries to boost supplies to Ukraine. Ukraine will receive a package of support worth 200 million from the UK and other European nations for military equipment, including spare parts for tanks and artillery ammunition, the UK government announced. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said foreign journalists from unfriendly nations will not get media accreditation for Putin's presidential address on 21st of February. Ukraine's state broadcaster reports that 6 aerial targets were recorded over Kiev during an air alert and that most were shot down. The US military said it had intercepted several Russian warplanes near Alaska on Monday. 4 Russian aircraft, including strategic bombers and fighter jets, were detected flying over international airspace near Alaska. Journalist Maria Ponomarenko has been sentenced to 6 years in prison in Russia and also banned from journalism for 5 years. The UN's humanitarian aid and refugee agency said Wednesday they are seeking 4.6 billion to help millions of people in Ukraine and countries that have taken in fleeing Ukrainians since Russia's invasion nearly a year ago. And now, Nicola Sturgeon's resignation. So let's reflect on that for a moment. William, were you surprised by the news?
I certainly wasn't expecting this morning. I would, if it come at some time in the next few months, simply of the complexity of what's going on now, also the distraction that is coming from really of the being made by the media, the difficulties in policy that there have been. Bearing in mind that Nicola Sturgeon had been First Minister for years and had taken us through the COVID pandemic, it's reasonable to think that she might have a wee bit. And there was just
I'm having a little problem with the sound here. Is anyone else experiencing that? We're having a little problem with your sound. I think you were just saying that you were surprised by the timing of the announcement.
Right. Okay.
Is that my?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. So I think you were just. Yeah, I think you were just saying that to kind of recap, you were just saying that obviously Nicola Sturgeon's been the First Minister for 8 years. She's taken us through COVID, and clearly she must be exhausted. She must be tired. It's been a huge load that she's been carrying. So I think we can all understand the personal reasons that she would
stop. I think anything would be that sort of workload. But also, I think in recent weeks, even she'd become the story, and it's not always a good thing for him to be the story. How about
Yeah. So yeah, I think the culture war that was, you know, yeah, yeah. So I was just going to recap on what William was kind of talking
so?
about, the way that
Well, you do
uh,
that, and I'll try and
the
reconnect.
culture war had been sort of stoked over the trans issue and was being used, clearly being used as a sort of wedge issue by the Conservatives, particularly. And I think I'd read in the Financial Times that Declan Anderson resigned from the Conservative Party. Ian Anderson, he's actually the chair of Stonewall as well, but he was a Conservative fund investor, and he resigned the other day. And the reason that he did that was he said that he'd had discussions with Rishi Sunak, and he felt that Sunak's tactic for the 2024 general election was going to be to stoke the culture war still further, and that was something that he didn't want to have any part of. But there's an obvious strategy which is now less available to the Conservatives now that Nicola Sturgeon's gone. I think it's going to be harder for them to to kind of stoke that particular culture war because it's hard
I,
to
I
imagine
think we'll make
there would be
I think we'll
major.
make every effort to. I hope you can hear me now better, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll keep going till it falls apart again. I'm having a great week with technology, so this is not a surprise to me. Um, yeah, I think she was becoming an easy target to hit repeatedly. But having said that, it also gave her the chance to showcase that she is a politician of the highest class. Scotland has been quite fortunate in having two successive first ministers who have been, I think, in my view, certainly in presentational terms and in communication terms, head and shoulders above your normal leader within the, and they have put Scotland on the map. Sturgeon they did. So, in essence, they'll be the way to see her off the scene. But also, I think from the independence movement's point of view, it gives us the chance for a reset. It gives the SE a chance to reconnect with this movement, a
Mm.
relationship that maybe had fractured just a little bit.
Yeah, I was talking to my uncle earlier, who's a kind of lifelong card-carrying SNP member, and he's really looking forward to the hustings and the debate because it's been a long time since there was a leadership debate, and it's going to be a very different debate. You know, having five potential SNP leaders in the room discussing things is going to give it a different feel. Maybe we can have a more open discussion about you know, the path to independence or a Scottish currency or what Scottish foreign affairs will look like or, you know, any of these issues that people are interested in, but it'll be less combative. Should be more interesting perhaps.
Well, I think it might give them the chance to talk about such a way that you can see the future. And visions for the future are a good thing if you're looking at something like an independence campaign. I danger that competition, the contest for the leadership, will detract from the independence movement. But yeah, it's going interesting.
I think it's you know, I think it's interesting to kind of it's tempting to just leap straight into what's next, but I think, you know, we should also take a little time just to reflect on, you know, Nicola Sturgeon's contribution. You know, when I think about her, I remember very vividly the day after the Brexit referendum when she, you know, it was a moment when a lot of people felt very lost and upset and shocked because the polls hadn't predicted it. And Nicola Sturgeon kind of came out and she talked directly to European citizens in Scotland and said, you know, we value you, we want you to stay. And nobody else really had that moment of empathy. And it was really important. She gave a very important speech. I felt that it was very humane and empathic and important.
Yeah, she certainly had the ability to be empathetic. And I think it was quite important that EU citizens in Scotland were told that we're with you and you're with us, and we want that to carry on. Um, I think the reaction to Brexit, we all thought we would be motoring towards an independence referendum at that time, and that didn't happen. And that may have led to some of the electoral issues they had in the 27 Westminster general election. But certainly at that very moment when we just unexpectedly found ourselves on the wrong end of the Brexit referendum, I think a lot of the connection that she made with EU citizens in Scotland was very effective, and indeed, probably to this day, has led to them being much more sympathetic to independence than they ever were in 2014.
That's true. It was really, yeah, and I think in the long term, it's a massive game changer. But yeah, I mean, obviously, it's difficult. Scotland's being adversely affected economically by Brexit and by the shrinking UK economy, and that's kind of creating a situation where people are concerned. But so, what do you remember of Nicola Sturgeon's earlier career as deputy leader? I think there was a moment when it looked like she might become leader back then.
Well, she was going to stand to be leader in 2004. At that time, I was living in sunny Berkshire, and I was getting my news from Scotland on Sunday. We actually had a shop that sold it, which was quite remarkable, and there was no doubt that she was one of the leading lights in the new Scottish Parliament, still at a very young age. When she announced her candidacy in 2004, initially, I think she must have been about 34. So, the same sort of ballpark as perhaps some of the contenders for the leadership will be now. Um, and yeah, she was one of the few Scottish politicians that I could actually recognise, because I kept reading about others in this fledgling parliament, and I couldn't put a face to them, but I certainly could put a face to Nicola Sturgeon. And it's that prominence, obviously, that would have encouraged her to stand in 2004. And of course, eventually, she ended up as the deputy to Alex Salmond. But also, though, and this is quite significant, leading the SNP in the Scottish Parliament, because Alex Salmond was still down at Westminster and effectively being leader of the opposition between 2004 and 2007. And to take the SNP from the position they had been in 2004, when they had been hemorrhaging support, to one where in 2007 they could actually take power, albeit just by the skin of their teeth, but a minority government that was actually one of the more effective of the Scottish governments we've had since devolution. I think that gives you an inkling of just how effective a politician at her peak she could be.
Yes, I think she brought that kind of professionalism, didn't she? She's always had a very kind of professional demeanor and that kind of air of competence. So I think in that parliament, was that the one where they had a kind of arrangement with the Conservatives, where the Conservatives under Annabel Goldie would give them the votes, or is that the 2011 one? When
No,
did
that would
they?
have been that would have been the 2007 one. To be
Right.
fair, I don't think they had a formal arrangement with the Conservatives. Minority governments have to work with the other
Yeah.
parties, and it has to be done very cleverly, and it's a very, very difficult skill. I was amazed that they managed it so well. Clearly, they managed it so well
Yeah.
that in 2011 they got a majority on their own.
Yes, I mean, I liked Annabel Goldie, and I think the Conservatives under Annabel Goldie were kind of very different. I mean, so I think that Parliament, you kind of saw in those days there was more of a sense of collaboration between different parties. I mean, obviously now we have the SNP and the Greens, but Anna Sarwar and Douglas Ross are just very shouty and angry, aren't they? This is sort of fall outrage. I think the whole vibe has become much more aggressive and perhaps difficult for a woman to really. I mean, I'm not saying that Nicola Sturgeon can't do it, but obviously it's a bit monotonous.
Well, it's very polarised, and it's very polarised because of the constitutional situation. And that's
Yeah,
the thing that overrides everything in Scottish politics now. Back in 2007, whereas the SNP were clearly on the up, there was no particular inkling that there would be an independence referendum within 7 years. The thing that caused that to become a near certainty was the election of the majority SNP government in 2011. So that first 10 years, if you like, or just over 10 years of the Scottish Parliament was, it was really, it was finding its feet, but it was also, I think, a very exciting time. Um, and
sure.
a lot of diversity. So you had diversity of parties, but also genuine conversations about where Scotland might be going. And you did get the impression that everybody was batting for Scotland at that time. You don't get that feeling nearly to the same extent these days. And the opposition has, I think, a lot of work to do really to win back the popular support it might at one stage have had, particularly Labour. But the Tories, I agree with you about Douglas Ross. I did think that of the various tributes to Nicola Sturgeon today, Douglas Ross's was not a particularly impressive one. And there was a lot of snarkiness in that. And others, such as even Ruth Davidson, such as even Rishi Sunak, such as even Anna Sarwar, pretty well did the right thing and said the right things that you always say in these situations. Douglas Ross, wee bit less so. And that, over time, should become more of a
Well, I mean,
problem
I
for the
suppose
Conservatives.
he might be the next leader to change. I mean, I think if the Conservatives are serious about, their next move, they'll probably have to change Douglas Ross, won't they? Because I mean, he's just, it's not personal, but I just don't think he's, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I suppose the SNP is quite different from the other parties in that the SNP sends their top talent to Holyrood. So, and I was, I don't want to get back onto that. Just to reel back to 2011, um, that's an interesting election because they didn't win so many first past the post seats as they subsequently won. They got more list seats, so that's kind of how they
Yes.
ended up with that thing that wasn't supposed to happen, which was an overall
It was
majority.
kind of a fluke. I mean, yes, it's not
Yeah,
supposed to happen. The system is supposed to work against it, and you would have to do normally, you'd have to do extraordinarily well. But it was just happened to be the right balance of constituency seats and list seats. You could argue that the result in 2021 was a better result in numerical terms, but of course not in terms of seats. But that was a big game changer because that meant we were into independence referendum territory at a time when
yeah.
Westminster didn't think independence was a significant issue or a big
Mm.
problem for them. So they were quite happy to say, yeah,
Well,
let's go
that's
ahead
another
and here's
memory.
30.
Yeah, that's another memory a lot of people will have of Nicola Sturgeon when because they had that big writing. Did they have the date of September, whatever it was, 2014, in huge like letters? And Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond were posing in front of the letters with big smiles on their faces to celebrate the Edinburgh Agreement that they'd made with David Cameron. And David Cameron, like, his modus operandi was that he came to Scotland and respectfully said, we recognise that Scotland's a voluntary partner in this union. That was part of his pitch because I guess because he was confident of winning, but part of his pitch was, of course, it's a voluntary union. Please have your referendum, have it now, because they're probably looking at the trends. They were like, have it now, and that was very amicable.
It was amicable, but I, I, I don't think you'll get that level of amicability again because now independence is right in the mainstream. Independence to Westminster, from their perspective, is a constant danger. And therefore, it's going to be much more of a struggle. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think by the technique of perhaps lengthening the campaign, because it was a good 2.5 years, I think, from the signing of the Edinburgh Agreement to the actual vote. And people said, well, that's far too long. You'd argue maybe it was because nothing significantly started to move until we were really into 2014. And maybe everything does speed up towards the end of a campaign. But it did give time for the Yes movement to get its act together a little bit. And I did feel then that there was much more affinity between the Yes movement in general and the SNP than there is today. And maybe that's something that the events of today might lead to a
Yeah,
resolution of, because I think it would be important for the politicians in the Yes movement to be on the same page as they were to a greater
yeah.
extent in those days.
Well, it's a huge achievement because if you look back when David Cameron came to Edinburgh to sign the Edinburgh Agreement, Ipsos Mori was showing support for independence at about 25%. And if you go back, across the decades before that, it kind of come up and down about 14% to 25%. But that's why they didn't regard it as a threat because it was 25%. So to get from that to almost winning is quite extraordinary, really.
It was good. It maybe peaked a couple of weeks too early, but what shouldn't be forgotten, since we're talking about Nicola Sturgeon, is that she basically ran the campaign. She oversaw the legislative process for it, but she was very much the public figure in the campaign, second only to Alex Salmond himself. But nevertheless, she was clearly the heir apparent should he ever step back, which of course he
Yeah.
subsequently did. But it's as much down to what she did in that campaign, um, uh, as certainly on the
Yeah.
political side, that we got as close as we did, but sadly not a winning
Yes.
campaign.
Well, I mean, perhaps, perhaps Scotland wasn't ready. I mean, I was on the no side then, and I felt that the country was very, very divided. But I really remember the day after. I just so remember the day after that campaign when David Cameron came out from Downing Street and shafted the Labour Party. I thought he was going to come out and thank Gordon Brown, but he came out and announced evil. So it's like, well, who? Why would you vote for Labour? Why would you vote for a Labour MP if they can't vote for Labour's domestic agenda?
Yeah.
It's pointless. Why would you vote for a pointless? So he just came out with a big knife and shafted Labour in the back, and they didn't see that coming at all because they'd basically won the campaign. They'd really fought very hard in that last couple of weeks, particularly. So that I
Oh,
remember that,
by
and
sending
then
all
of
the
course
people
Alex
up for the
Salmond
Imperial
resigning.
War March, I remember.
What was that?
Our Imperial Masters were walking up Buchanan Street, I seem to recall, with a celebrated
Yeah,
soundtrack. That was Labour throwing the kitchen sink at it.
yeah.
And they
So I
certainly
think
did.
that was the Labour Party's never really recovered from that
I,
because
I
it
think
just
not, and it's not really recovered from basically its attitude to the Smith Commission either. So, I mean,
yeah,
what we didn't expect in September 2014 was that in the 2015 general election, the SNP would take 56 seats. And the other thing we didn't
yeah,
expect was that the SNP's membership would, quintuple initially. I think it went from the
yeah,
25,000 sort of mark to the 125,000, it is said in the books of Peter
yeah.
Murrell. But certainly that was not, and certainly in those first 3 weeks after IndyRef 2014, that was not the next development we all expected. We
No,
kind of
no.
got ourselves back together within 3 weeks, and then suddenly the changes, and they were coming, a lot of them, from the Labour Party.
Yes, of course, because they had just messed up so badly. They had messed up so badly. In that Project Fear, there's a memorable line about how they were a bride who's completely focused on the wedding. They'd given no thought to what happens afterwards. But yeah, no, they messed up big time. And then of course Salmond resigns and Nicola Sturgeon becomes the leader, and she is a fresh face, much more someone that a woman can relate to. I think she's got that warmth and that empathy, and I suppose the period of from 2014 is a period where Scotland does begin to diverge. I think politically, I mean the divergence has already started, but I think in terms of values and policies and things like trying to make like society fairer and progressive tax and everything, she brings in a bigger emphasis on those kind of policies, doesn't she?
Well, certainly, yes, and certainly as a feminist, she made a point, I think, of her first cabinet being a gender balanced cabinet, and certainly she was very popular with the women voters for a while. Less so recently because of the fallout from the GRR, and that's something that might need to be fixed going forward. But certainly in those days, those heady days of the Hydro conference, where there was standing room only and the acclaim
Mm.
of all that, it looked as if things were really going places. Um, were
Yeah,
they
she
doing
traveled
so in
around the
policy terms?
country.
Not sure, but sorry,
Yeah, she traveled around the country and she did all these gigs and
that's right. Yes,
yeah, and all these people, and it was like I stand with Nicola. So she was really like a rock star almost. Yeah, yeah,
exceptional ratings. I mean, to this day, she has better ratings than other UK politicians, but in those days, they were truly exceptional. And there was an
yeah,
opportunity there. And whether it was
yeah.
completely taken, there is a question mark.
Well, I think she focused very much on the she has focused very much on the day job, really. I mean, and the sort of assertion from her opponents that she doesn't is really not true because she really has. And then there was so many difficult things that she had to deal with. I mean, the sort of whole the Alex Salmond thing. I don't know if you've read the book about that, the breakup book, um, but she managed to kind of stay out of the fray as much as possible. But obviously that must have been it was so difficult. And remember the kind of feeding frenzy where all the she has faced, I think, the most hostile domestic media of any leader. I can't imagine. I can't think of another country where the domestic media is owned and controlled from another country. It's been very much on a kind of unionist agenda since 2014, when independence started to be seen as a real threat. And there was such a feeding frenzy around trying to drag Nicola Sturgeon into that and trying to kind of say she, was it somehow involved and knew more or knew less, or I can't remember the detail of it, but I remember the kind of enormous circus that was unleashed by all that.
There was a circus, and I have a hint of uneasiness about the whole Alex Salmond affair. And I think for a lot of independent supporters, they share that. I don't know where the truth lies, but it certainly is the case that it was at that point, whether by accident or by the design of her enemies, I don't know, that some of the gloss started to come off Nicola Sturgeon, and she became perhaps a more polarizing figure within the Yes movement as well
Oh
as
yes.
within the UK.
Mm. Because then Alex Salmond started his own party, and some key people like Kenny McCaskill defected to it. So yeah, obviously there was a split. There was a definitely split as a result of all that. Um, yeah, so the kind of I guess that's the pride comes before a fall. The great tour, and
Well,
then Me Too. Obviously she's a feminist. The whole Me Too thing, she couldn't not prosecute. She was like, deal with this. They prosecuted. That's nothing to do with her. And without going into the detail of that, um, it was a difficult situation for her, I'm
yes,
sure. And then
and
COVID.
so
Yeah, yeah,
well, yeah, COVID, of course, came before Alaba, and so that was another boost in a sense to Nicola in
yeah,
reputational terms because she was at her peak in terms of communication. I thought with the COVID pandemic,
yeah,
with the daily press conferences, and her opponents, her constitutional opponents, hated it. They wanted the broadcasts taken off, but she was
yeah.
getting across to people in a way that the Westminster spokespeople were not.
No, I mean, it has been a period of stability in that she's been there day in, day out, always looking the part, always speaking carefully, always being considerate and empathic and trying to kind of do her job the best she can. And that period of stability is what people might remember. And I think certainly, my elderly mother really appreciated those because she was nervous. She's immunocompromised. She watched Nicola every day, and she found it very, very reassuring. And I was upset on her behalf when the new Tory Director General of the BBC tried to take her off, and it was only available on the digital channel, which my mum's just not technologically competent enough to get. So, yeah, yeah, I was annoyed about that. But
It is
yeah,
a
so I
case
think
of other things.
she did. She was reassuring. What was that?
Um,
Broadcasting Scotland. Yeah, you can see on Broadcasting Scotland. I know, but my mum just can't. She's not very good with technology. But
we need to
yeah.
get
So
Broadcasting Scotland fixed so that people who aren't digitally savvy can see it more easily.
on their TV.
Maybe on smart
Yeah, that would be
TVs with
great.
you.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, so those were those sort of difficult, scary days for people. They did really respond to Nicola, and then as that kind of wound down, and then the reality of kind of Brexit and the economy and the cost of living and everything like that started to bite. I suppose it has kind of it's just meant everybody's chasing more money, and there just isn't more money. Like we see the teachers strike.
Yeah,
What did you
but
say? I'm hearing something in my ear. But yeah, so I think yeah, there's maybe a bit of economic stagnation. So there's maybe a bit of stagnation going on. Oh dear, lost my sound. What's going on with that? Um,
can you hear me all right? Oh, okay, that's okay.
okay.
Well,
So
yeah.
yeah, those are
Um,
memories that everyone has. I think everyone memories of Nicola Sturgeon. With her, was looking very kind of soigné and kind of just very, very professional. I mean, I think personally one of the downsides for Nicola Sturgeon is I think being married to Peter Morrell, there's been a little bit of difficulty about that. And I think when the party was so small, it was like two men and a dog, and in a wee shed. It didn't matter that the chief executive effectively was married to the president or whatever. But I think now it's not the best situation. It's if it just it's a bit too cozy. I think having, and then Nicola Sturgeon has faced unpleasant questions about her husband having lent money to the party, and it's not what you want. I think that's an area of weakness for her, really.
I think it's an area of weakness for the party that they continue to allow the chief executive to be married to the party leader. That should not happen, and there should be something in the party constitution to prevent it. Even if you're two men and a dog, or two people and a dog, as in the old days, because it is something that can lead to exactly the sort of situation we're seeing, where either or both of them can become compromised, whether or not that's justified. So I would encourage the party, not that I'm part of the party, so they won't listen to me for sure, but I would encourage the party to consider its constitution and see if that sort of thing can be invented in future.
Yeah, I think it has been an area of weakness really over the years, because I think there's been times when the selection of candidates, or there have been areas as well to do with managing the salmon situation, when that kind of slightly over close relationship has become an issue. Yeah, so I would agree with you that it's when you as well it is a much bigger party now. It is the party of government, and a degree of professionalism that you expect is higher. Yeah, so I would agree with you on that. Yeah, yeah. But
Okay.
Nicola Sturgeon has done. I think she's done a terrific job, and I actually really respect the way that she has stood up for transgender people, because I think the whole. I mean, I have I'm a lot of my friends are old feminists. I have lots of friends who are like, why do you have she her on your profile? And it's just like, I know a lot of people on both sides of the debate, but I just feel really strongly that Nicola Sturgeon has kind of stood by her values, and her values are like You don't allow people to be used as pawns in a culture war. It's not how people should be treated. And a lot of the reporting of this has been so incendiary and so inaccurate, and that's exactly what happens in a culture war. So I really respect her, and I actually think the fact that Anna Sarwar and Alex Cole Hamilton voted for it and then ducked for cover and and left her alone to face the music and never stood up for it, it just doesn't reflect very well on them. That's my view.
It doesn't reflect the state of Scotland that certainly opposition politicians can cross party bill and say, quite rightly, duck, duck for cut. I think the our should have been a lot easier than it was, and it was very badly explained. And what I think was a problem, because this did Nicola Sturgeon some support with many women, no doubt whatsoever about. And I think um, it's 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 really a case of trying to separate out gender concerns may exist and may be perfectly respect from what's actually trying to be a slightly disguised. And a lot of the concerns have been a mixture of that. But some, I think, have
A lot
been
of the
from
concerns have
a
been really,
position, you
you
know,
know, I think that a
uh,
lot of some of the reporting about, the Scottish Prison
yeah,
Service, I just don't believe the Scottish Prison Service has acted in the way that's suggested. And I think Scottish people from the Scottish Prison Service have kind of been on and tried to explain that they haven't, but it's just that kind of whole culture war narrative.
yeah,
Nobody's really
absolutely.
interested in what actually
The,
happened.
the, some of the reporting on the prison things, that is nothing to do with the GRR, because GRR has not been passed. That's to do with the Equalities Act 2010, which exists throughout the whole of the UK, and the problems exist. They are problems in England as well. And the prison in question, I think, was going through the procedure for dealing with a new prisoner who was transgender, and there was never any danger of anybody being put in danger.
Yeah. I mean,
So
the
I
Scottish
think
Prison
that
Service know what
misreport,
they're doing, I'm sure. Yeah.
but
And
I
I
do
just think
think,
the whole thing we should probably kind of let's not get bogged down in this subject, but I've seen a
because
lot
I
of
always
very,
get
very
bogged down in it, and
irresponsible
I have
reporting
enough
about it.
discussions about this at Harvard, you would believe it.
What was that? You
Sorry,
just leave it.
go
Yeah.
on,
I know it's a minefield. Let's just
moving on.
leave it before. But I mean, I think in general, I respect Nicola Sturgeon's. I've never respected her more actually than when she was standing up for transgender people alone, and I just felt like the Scottish Labour Party. I thought they behaved absolutely scandalously. Because they voted for it practically unanimously, as far as I know, and then Westminster told them to back off, so they kind of they were nowhere to be seen. You know, and I just thought I didn't like the way they behaved. But anyway, Nicola dealt with it as well as she could, and I think having resigned is probably a good thing because the whole culture war thing is now not so easy for the unionists to play as a card. Um,
Surprised. I think they've got several bits of cult to come. I think it may be a good thing for Nicola Sturgeon, because I do think that she absolutely needs to recharge her bat and to focus on out of power when we the issues that she wants to support, and she mentioned with them today. And I think if she looks tired now, and I think actually held up remarkably well over the years compared to certainly some men you aged remarkably in that period of time. I think she'll look a lot fresher and a lot more relaxed, perhaps in a year's time, than she does now, and that can only be good for her. For the generally, it does a chance set, and I do think still that the the op in the campaign for independence will do everything they can, first of all, to blacken her legacy. And you saw Glenn having a shot at that in the Vale end of
oh yeah,
speech.
well, the press conference today. What behaviour!
Absolutely.
What behaviour? I saw them.
Um,
So they had on Twitter there was footage of Glenn Campbell and James Cook, having a wee exchange about how had to pay too high taxes or something, and then and then yeah, I thought Glenn Campbell was really he just I thought the kind of shouting is very tabloid. It's like when I was a journalist, I worked for a news agency and we worked for I worked for tabloids and stuff. But I mean, actually, to do them justice, they wouldn't have liked because you know it's just like you're representing the BBC. You're not some kind of tabloid hack. You're representing the BBC. Behave better. I think that's what I thought. Well, it was just like,
BBC is
but
very
actually,
much, certainly in
mm,
Scotland, very much part of the
yeah,
culture wars. And what you heard
yeah,
today was no different from the basically
yeah,
the questioning in the other press conferences that Nicola Sturgeon has been holding over the last few weeks. I was beginning to think she should stop because if a thing is repeated enough, it does get traction. And there are some concerns to be addressed, but not in the relentless way that we're seeing. It was not the occasion, I think, for it. But I do
yeah,
think there's a chance, at least for the yes movement, to have a reset and really to establish where it stands in some of these issues so as to be able to fight back better against the tide of propaganda. And I do hope we find
yeah,
a unifying leader and somebody that will more obviously work with the independence movement. Because the big criticism in the independence movement is that, ironically, for somebody who's constantly being reminded by the Tories to do her day job, um, Nicola Sturgeon never really reached out to the Yes movement in the way that people had been expecting, bearing in mind that she'd run the campaign in 2014. And
yeah,
everybody was looking, or is looking still, to the SNP conference in March to see what comes out of that as a way forward, but also to see how is the SNP linking up with the wider movement? Because the wider movement, if the SNP doesn't link up with it, is going to get on with it anyway. And that's not a recipe for success. It's a recipe for trying to
yes.
get it done, but it's not necessarily a recipe for
But I
success.
think I think the pursuit of unity might be a bit of a chimera because essentially the independence movement has to be a coalition of, socially conservative, rural voters and urban progressives, and it can't succeed if it becomes just one or the other. So I think you
I
that's and
don't, I
that's
don't think we should
why
become
wedge issues
vanilla.
are so effective against an independence movement
Yeah.
because it's quite easy to separate a segment of voters. If you get the right wedge issue, you can go in there and move them away. So I think that's why it's challenging, but I don't know that unity is possible on subjects like that.
Unity isn't desirable. That's a bit vanilla. But being able to work together and being able to recognize a wedge issue for what it is and responding appropriately to a wedge issue, those are fundamental painting 101. Hell, better managed it in 2014. They hated the sight of each other, and yet they were able effectively to work together. I think the Yes Move to be able to do that. I think it would do it better if it had a less relationship with the SNP as it now is. It would certainly do it a lot better if the various political parties within it weren't slagging each other off. And that works on both sides. But there's a road to travel for the independence movement, and that I hope it can manage over the next few weeks, just to pull itself together sufficiently to be a worthwhile campaigning organisation that can respond
Yeah.
to the attacks rather than being seen to amplify the attacks, as so often sometimes they are.
I think it's very easy to walk into the trap. It's the sort of angernomics, you kind of if you sort of hook into people's anger and amplify it, and if you can sort of hook into people's anger like that, then it's powerful. It's powerful. So I think so. Let's
Yeah.
talk about the candidates. So I was sort of reading somewhere that now the SNP is a party of government. It's attracting a very different kind of person. Less the kind of maverick, passionate. indie person that might have joined it, but now, you know, there are a lot more people who are who are joining it because it's the party of government, and they see it as a good place to be for a career. What do you who do you think who do you see as being a talented next leader?
Well, we need to see who's actually going to stand. I think there are some talents within the SNP. I I'm not entirely sure if they've always been given significant place yet within the party. Some of them have, some of them have not. There was always the criticism again of Nicola Sturgeon that there was the inner circle, and it was what the inner circle thought would determine what came next. And there was also a charge, and I just lay it out there, that maybe she promoted a bit more mediocrity rather than the people that might threaten her position. That's what politicians do. So if it is true, I wouldn't be at all surprised. As to the
Who would you see as being a talented person that didn't?
as a talented person, well, I think Kate Forbes is a talented person. However, she is young. She does just have a new baby and a relatively new husband. Um, I don't think that should be a barrier at all to her taking over, but I would question whether she wants to. Because I
Well,
think if she
Stephen
did want
Flynn's
to,
got a new
we might,
baby too. Stephen Flynn has a
yes,
new baby.
and it should be exactly the same for a man or a woman. Stephen Flynn might want to. I'm just not convinced that Kate Forbes would, but I think if she did, it's yet
Yeah.
to be tested how she would be as an actual leader, but certainly she, in difficult circumstances, has done very well, or she did do very well with that very
Yeah.
first budget that was kind of forced on her on the day. Um, but
I quite
Stephen
like Jenny
Flynn,
Go Ruth. I think if I
Jenny
what do you
Ruth
think of Jenny Go
is
Ruth?
clearly a talent, and yeah, I think she answers the questions quite well. I think she's a fairly holistic
Got a
view
bit
of how things
feisty.
should
She's a little
be.
bit feisty. I can imagine her, like dealing with, Douglas Ross or Anna Sarwar as if they were sort of disruptive pupil in her class. Because
Perhaps
she used to be a teacher, and I can imagine her being able to kind of deal with that. I
yeah.
just think she's got a bit of edge.
The interesting thing would be if any of the Westminster contingent are interested, because of course they would have to get themselves elected, and that would be a tricky. But
They can't,
I
yeah.
think a lot of the talent is in Westminster as well. Stephen Flynn has made a decent start and clearly has some ideas about where things should go. Whether he has the ambition to be First Minister in this sort of time scale is a question.
I don't
But
think
certainly he would
Stephen
have to
Flynn can
be
do it because I do think
Cumming-esque
you have to
anyway.
be an MSP, and he has just started. Um, but yeah, so there are people say that Mari McCallan is very talented, but she's young. She's only
Yes,
30.
she comes across very well.
Yeah.
She does come
Yes.
across very well, and I think it would be great to see somebody who was younger anyway. So the fact that so many of the candidates we're thinking of are relatively recent intake, I think is a good thing. And if you look back, Nicola Sturgeon herself was 34 when she stood for the leadership. So it's a perfectly valid
There
thing
are
to be
some
doing.
older
And,
candidates. I mean, John
oh
Swinney
yes, that would
potentially.
be ageist.
Yeah. I mean, John Swinney's not that old. I don't know how old he is, but he's not. He's nothing like as old as Joe Biden.
He's
He's
not,
probably.
but he didn't set the heather on fire when he led the SNP as an opposition party between 2000 and 2004. And I would question whether he wanted at this stage
Yes.
to take over as First Minister. And
And
I'm not
Angus.
quite sure what the answer is to that.
Yeah. Angus Robertson.
Angus Robertson would see himself as born for the role. That's why he came back to Holyrood. He actually thought, right, okay, he didn't voluntarily leave Westminster, but he certainly took his chance getting into Holyrood when he did. I'm not sure how popular he is, and it will be down to the members of the party to elect. I don't think Angus Robertson necessarily comes across that well to SNP members from the conversations I've had with SNP members. So he would definitely, I think, be a candidate. I'd be amazed if he weren't. but whether he is the one that gets it is a big question mark for me.
And Humza Yusuf, he's quite young.
Humza Yusuf, yeah, he's had two fairly significant roles, and certainly a tough role right now with the health service. A lot of flack thrown at the Scottish Health Service by often English commentators, which I think is a disgrace. Um, there are problems in the health service. There are problems with the health service throughout the UK. But it is actually a valid point that Scotland is managing the problems better, statistically speaking, and certainly does not seem to, the NHS does not seem to be in anything like the state of disrepair as it is in other places.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, he's
I've
yeah,
heard from
yeah.
somebody who's worked with whom's on one of the health boards that actually he knows his stuff. He's pretty good, and he is a tough negotiator, and that's a good
He's
thing.
done well because
He
there's no
just
strike. Yeah. Unlike with the
he
teaching
doesn't
unions, which is
yeah
a shame that
he
it's a
get
shame that the situation with the teaching unions is like that because, they didn't even put their offer to their members, and I think possibly it was maybe a bad idea to like tweet it out before talking to the unions because, teachers don't like that kind of thing.
yeah
But
I think
anyway,
yeah.
yeah.
Now the wild card,
Ash,
as
what's her
many
name?
people have mentioned,
Ash Regan. Ash Regan?
Ash Regan, yes. Um, Almost impossible to know how she would fare in a leadership role. All I can say is that when she stood up for a minority position in the recent debate, she did so very well and very effectively. And I thought she came across very well. She didn't come across who was somebody who was just being fractious. She had a reasoned point of view, and she stuck up for her principles. And I think they were decent principles
Okay.
as well, even if they weren't the
Yeah.
majority view. Now, how popular she would be within the party is a question mark, and how she would fare as a leader. I mean, this is true of anybody. If you've no succession plan in place, you're always going to
Yeah.
have this. And it's almost a case of have a look and see. And it's not as if other political parties haven't made horrendous mistakes in the last few months down in Westminster. So, you can get yourself out of trouble if you absolutely have to. No, I think Ash Regan would be a very interesting candidate, and I would like to see her stand to see how she did.
It's going to be so interesting to hear them debating different issues that are important to the independence movement. Keith Brown, he's
Keith
a deputy
Brown's been
leader,
around for a wee while, and indeed was the voice of the SNP to the independence movement for a time. Um, the, the, yeah, I think he's clearly a major figure within the party, um, and probably popular enough to get it. I just have some doubts about Keith Brown in a leadership role. One of the
right?
ones who will put himself forward, I'm sure, is Alan Smith. And,
Right.
well,
He's an MP though,
he's
isn't
got
he?
the
He's
same
an
problems
MP.
as some of the others, but I'm sure that
Yeah.
he would find a way of standing. Again, the popularity question, not sure. This is wide open.
Depends
It
what the
really
time
is.
scale is. It depends what the time scale is.
There is,
Neil Gray. Someone mentioned Neil Gray. He's a bit of a dark horse.
yes.
I don't know
I
much
don't
about
know
him.
very much about Neil Gray, but again, what I've seen of him, he comes across well. This is an opportunity for a wide selection of people. I mean, it'll get cut down fairly quickly, I'm sure, but I think it
Yeah.
would be really good to have a proper contest because the SNP hasn't had a proper contest for quite some time. Nicola Sturgeon didn't
Yeah.
have anybody standing against her, and Alex Salmond, something was worked out basically in the end. So it would be nice now to see the talent that's in the SNP come to the fore and show itself off by campaigning for the leadership in a dignified and forward looking and positive way that enthused the elect, because that is the
Yeah.
important thing that they need to do. And
Well, the
that also
Tories
gives them
made
a chance
hay
to
with their little contest, didn't they? I mean, they were sort of forever on the news and having hustings and having kind of debates where they kind of, I think the effect of that was to kind of normalize some of their insanely right wing policies. So I think, just if you're having a debate where there's five people who are passionate supporters of Scottish independence, I think this is just an interesting beginning, isn't it? Because we don't normally see that.
Then normalise some insane, indeed perfectly sensible independence talk. That would be good, wouldn't it? And get
Well, just
airtime
normalise
for it.
ideas of like,
Unusual.
well, we're going to have a Scottish currency. How's that going to work? And everybody in the room's just like, well, like other countries have their own currency, it'll be fine. But I think just it'll kind of it might just change the kind of the way that these conversations happen a little bit because
I
as we
think if it does
discussed
nothing
earlier,
else,
often mediated by a very strongly unionist media.
yeah. But I do think that there'll be some conversations that take place that the undecided can't avoid hearing, which is not always the case. And that, as you say, normalizing the debate, and as long as it's done in a dignified way and very positive way too, I think it's a game changer, and it could be a game changer for the better.
Yeah, Broadcasting Scotland, I think would love to host a hustings for the different leaders and
Mm-hmm.
have someone put questions to them, and yeah, be it's going to be like we might as well enjoy it, be a bit of entertainment and hopefully an opportunity for people to just open up the debate and include more people in it. Um, you
Yeah.
know, uh,
Make sure that independence is always on the agenda, because we are now in a campaign of indeterminate length, but that's what we're in. So it mustn't
uh,
be a distraction.
okay. Well, I think we're going to end it there, but just to say that Broadcasting Scotland, um, the programs are free to watch, but we're very dependent on your subscriptions, and very grateful to those of you who do subscribe. And if you feel that you can afford to make a monthly donation, then please go to the Broadcasting Scotland site and do that. Or even a one-off donation if you don't want to commit to a monthly one is always welcome. Thank you. Yeah, we'll refuse nothing but blows, someone said over here. So, thank you very much for watching.